بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. We are continuing the station of Rida, and last week we left off in the middle of the second level of Rida. So we're continuing that today, in which Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala says, وَهُوَ الرِّضَى عَنْهُ فِي كُلِّ مَا قَضَى, to be pleased with Allah in all that He has decreed. So Rida, accepting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the first level is about accepting Him as our Lord, and we discussed that. And the second level, according to Abu Ismail, is accepting Allah's decree, His qada and His qadar. And we also engaged the leveling of Abu Ismail and said that perhaps what's more accurate is to actually flip it. The former is a higher level of iman than the latter, and we discussed this, but just to kind of remind ourselves where exactly we are. So Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala is saying that part of accepting Allah's qada and qadar is accepting all that He decrees. So to truly accomplish or establish this aspect of rida, it can't just be in some things and not in other things. We need to reach a level of iman where we are comfortable with all of Allah's qada and qadar. And Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi goes through about 30 pages of information here that we've kind of gone over in previous sessions, and we went over in our classes about Aqidah, the book we did before this one, Aqidah Tahawiyya. So I'm not going to go into all of the information, the details there, but I'll try to summarize it as best as possible. And that is, it's not as simple as how Abu Ismail is articulating it here. In other words, Allah's decree isn't always something that Allah is pleased with. So, why would Allah decree something that He's not pleased with? And then we go into the details of Allah might decree something that He doesn't like. Likewise, He might not decree something which He would like. So for example, Allah might decree that an individual doesn't accept Islam. Why? Because of certain things that individual has done to earn that disbelieving status. So Allah decreed it, He allowed it to happen, but it doesn't please Him. Likewise, Allah is pleased when someone accepts Islam, when someone is committed to the religion, yet He might allow people not to do that, even though doing it would be more pleasing to Him. And the issue or the topic of Allah's qada and qadar is very, very complex, very complex. And the deeper you dive into it, the more complex it becomes. And its complexity just goes back to reality. And that is, there are so many factors that are known as well as unknown to the individual that Allah knows all of. So when we try and come to a conclusion, we need to gather all of the relevant information for us to be able to make a good conclusion or an accurate conclusion. If we are missing some of that information, then our conclusion will weaken in accordance to the amount of information we don't have. Now, we as human beings, we have information about reality or about an individual, but there's more information we don't have. Allah does have that information, and accordingly, He allows something to happen or doesn't allow something to happen. So when we start to engage the issue or the topic of Allah's qada and qadar, we are just navigating an ocean we have no navigation for. An ocean we have absolutely no familiar, or we don't have enough information to navigate correctly. Right? So that's why this is such a difficult topic to engage, and that's why I tend to not get too much into detail here, but to kind of highlight the foundations necessary for us to at least have a basic understanding where we have an amount of comfort in accordance to it. And to do that, we can split our rida of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into three types. Al-rida billah, being pleased with Allah, and we discussed that last week. Ar-rida anillah, being pleased with what Allah does, and we're discussing this now. And ar-rida biqada'illah, and being pleased with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the difference between the second and the third one is that the second one is we are pleased with Allah as being the sovereign, the authoritative being governing all things, in terms of qada and qadar, whereas the third one is being pleased with the qada itself. So some people might be, I am pleased, I am okay, I've made peace with the fact that Allah is the one who decreed this, but I don't like what He decreed. So the second one is about the first part of this, whereas the third one is about the second part. Right? I hope I didn't lose you and confuse you here. So ar-rida anillah, being pleased with Allah as the decreer, is about making peace with the fact that Allah has so much control of what goes on, and accepting that and being pleased with it. Ar-rida biqada'illah is referring to being pleased with Allah's decree itself, is referring to the decree itself. Yes, I understand Allah decreed it, I made peace with that, but some people may not have made peace with the decree itself and its implications on a person's life. And you hear this a lot. Someone loses a loved one, right? They lose someone near and dear to them. And they say, I'm okay, Allah, I accept that Allah has decreed this, but it's so hard. I just want to understand why this happened. I wish it didn't happen, right? So I hope it's clear now the difference between these two. And just to remind ourselves, rida is not always an obligation on the individual. So someone who is struggling to accept the event itself, we won't look to him or her as being a bad Muslim or, saying something that is heretical or anything like that. Okay? So this is kind of how we better understand this notion of accepting all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees. So we have now two kind of main issues here. Number one, to differentiate between what pleases Allah from His qadar versus what doesn't please Him from His qadar. And that Allah may do a qadar that He is not pleased with. And Allah may not do a qadar that would please Him if He were to do it. So we differentiate there. So when Abu Ismail says that we are pleased with all of Allah's qadar, this needs qualification. Right? It needs a little bit more detail. It can be part of Allah's qadar, or let me use this example. It was Allah's qadar that Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl die in a state of disbelief. But He's not pleased with it. So accordingly, we are not pleased with the fact that Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab died in a state of disbelief. We are not pleased with their actions. Although after the fact, after their book of deeds has been sealed, we say that is Allah's qadar. Right? Does that make sense? So it's too broad of a statement to say that we are pleased with everything that goes on. Why? Because our rida needs to be in accordance with Allah's acceptance and what He loves and what He doesn't like. We are pleased, we have rida for things that is pleasing to Allah. We don't have rida for things that is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that clear? Yeah, but what determines that? Yes. But what is the scale that we use to determine this? Is Allah pleased with it or not? Right? So you're correct in saying that we accept that this is Allah's decision, right? But whether or not we are pleased with it goes back to whether or not it's pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So if someone is displeased with a certain event because it's displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is in line with our love for Allah. That is submission to Allah. Right? Okay, so I hope that clarifies there. Okay, and again, Ibn Qayyim goes through a lot of detail about this topic, but again, I just want to kind of gloss over it as to not get into all the nitty-gritty stuff that really might not be necessary for us or we have gone over before. So in order to kind of better articulate how we implement Rida in relationship to Allah's qada and qadar, it has to go back to how we understand love of Allah. We love what Allah loves, and we don't like what Allah doesn't like. So from this angle, we are better able to navigate Allah's qada and qadar when we are pleased with it, when we are accepting of it, versus when we are not. Right? And to always remember that it is part of Allah's qadar that He allows a human being to make free choices. It is your free will that brought you to attend this session. For those who choose not to attend it, right, it is their free will that gives them that ability to make this decision. So, when it comes to this, yes, the individual by choice may have chosen to obey or disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But that still falls under Allah's qadar in the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed that to happen. Okay. Now, Ibn Qayyim then goes into details about, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might decree something that is displeasing to Him, and why He might not decree something that would be pleasing to Him. Allah is pleased when someone obeys Him, and therefore it would be more pleasing to Allah if all human beings were, under the religion of Islam, worshipping Him. That is more pleasing to Allah. Yet Allah, in the many times in the Quran, says, if He wanted to, He would have made us all under faith. He would have made us all faithful people, but He didn't. So why is that? Well, there are certain wisdoms as to why not. And the next station after Rida is the station of shukr. And I will mention this again, but just kind of give you a sneak peek. Something like something that is uncomfortable to us, something like the cold. Now, cold is part of our ecosystem, it's part of our reality. Some areas are colder than others, but just take the example of cold. We don't like the cold weather in a sense that it creates us or makes for us an amount of discomfort. Yet Allah decrees it. Now, when you look at it from the following angle, what do we need to do in order to protect ourselves from the bitter cold? We need to wear heavier clothing. We need to shelter ourselves in our homes. We need to turn on the heat in our homes. We need to do other things. Now, there are certain luxuries that we enjoy when it's colder outside, like hot chocolate or a nice cup of hot tea or a hot herbal drink, something like that, among other things. Now, essentially, when we begin to assess how we react to bitter cold, it begins to highlight something. It's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed the bitter cold in order to bring our attention to these many blessings that we have. To show us that I decreed one small thing that is negative to your lives, or supposedly negative to your lives, in order to expose a multitude of blessings that I have offered you in order to take care of yourself in the cold. Without that cold, these things would be meaningless. Heat, central heat, would be meaningless. Without heat outside, air conditioning would be meaningless. Right? Now, this is not to say that these things are essential to our lives and that we are enjoying a lot because of it, but it does come to show us how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides us the means of staying comfortable. And for us human beings, because of our short-sightedness, we only appreciate these things when there's something discomforting in our lives. We appreciate these things, these blessings, when in a more reactionary manner. We are reacting to something else. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees something that is perceived to be negative in order to expose a lot of good. Does that make sense? So the primary example of this is Iblis. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed Iblis to disbelieve. And Iblis is running wild, running rampant for the past tens of millennia, however long human beings have been on this earth, with the sole effort, the sole purpose of trying to get as many human beings to the hellfire. Now, this is something very negative. And regardless of where you are on the spiritual spectrum, regardless of how strong your spirituality is, the devils are always trying to interfere. Allah allowed this to happen. But by allowing it to happen, He exposes a lot of other good. You being here, right, is not simply a mundane effort to build your iman. It's not simply that. Rather, you being here is a type of jihad. It's a type of struggle and strive that you are enduring and you're persevering through. Why? Well, because there are so many other factors in life that are trying to attract you to it and distract you from this. So you being here isn't simply, I have nothing else to do, I'm just going to come here. You have many other things to do. And on top of that, you have the shayateen, the devils coming and trying to dissuade you from attending. Yet you attend. Now, what does that mean about you? What is that a statement of about you? That there is an amount of good in your heart that takes you to this good. Now, if you were to exclude these other, these rivals in this competition, what would it really mean to come and participate in a lecture then? And this is why the Prophet ﷺ says that the one who worships him in times of fitan, in times of tribulation, in times of indecencies and lack of faith or faithless times, gets the reward or is like the one who immigrates to me. Back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, before the conquest of Mecca, migrating or immigrating to Medina was an obligation on all believers. And there was a huge amount of reward. Right? And the Prophet now is saying that those who are worshiping Allah in times of faithlessness is getting something similar because of how difficult it is, because of the many elements dissuading the individual, pressuring them not to take this step. So we here in the Western world, living under, the lifestyle of the West and how it dominates the mind and our, decisions. Yet you have many believers who continue to remain committed to the faith. Well, what does that say about what they're really doing? So by allowing the devils to do what they do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes the pureness or the gold status of the hearts of many people, without which it wouldn't be there. So if you remember when COVID first began, and we had a lot of those series of Friday night or Saturday night talks or whatever it was, one of the things I mentioned is that look at how humans are reacting to the situation. You have so many people rising to the occasion, so many people, putting themselves in harm's way in order to help those who are in need. Well, what is that saying about the people of society? That there's still a lot of good in them. There's still a lot of potential. Now, were it not for COVID, we may not have recognized this. We may not have seen that, wait a minute, there's still good in us. There's still a lot of potential in us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows certain things to happen that are displeasing to Him because it brings about other things that are very pleasing to Him. Like the sending of messengers, like the presence of believers in the sea of disbelief, in the sea of misconceptions, in the sea of anti-religious sentiments, among other things. Okay. And then Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala continues and says, وَيَصِحُّ بِثَلَاثَةِ شَرَائِط. The second level of Rida is fulfilled when three conditions are fulfilled. The first, بِاسْتِوَاءِ الْحَالَاتِ عِنْدَ الْعَبْدِ, when the situations, the possibilities of a person's life or of an event have become the same to the individual. Meaning, whether this happens or not is equal to me. It's the same. My reaction will be the same. Why? Because I have built enough trust in Allah to know that whatever Allah decides for me is what's best for me. So if I apply for a job, whether I get it or not, I will be the same. It really makes no difference to me whether I get it or not. Why? Because I know that whatever happens is Allah's decree, and Allah only decrees that which is in my best interest. Now, this doesn't mean we become immune to emotions. I keep saying this, and I want to emphasize this. It doesn't mean we become immune to emotions. It doesn't mean we become indifferent. Someone might really want a job, right? And they might be really excited if they got it, and they might feel a little bit sad if they didn't get it. But whether they get it or not doesn't change their perception of Allah, doesn't change their relationship with Allah, nor does it change the way they engage their religion. This is what we are trying to reach. Right? Again, we are not trying to reach emotional immunity. That is unhealthy. That is against the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He made it in a way where if something we perceive to be good occurs, we are happy. It makes us happy. It makes us excited. And if something we perceive to be negative occurs, it makes us sad. It makes us angry. That is normal. But the goal is rather to discipline our behavior, to discipline our opinion of Allah and our perception of Allah, to where this becomes indifferent to what happens in our lives. Whether I am wealthy or poor isn't going to change my commitment to the 5 daily prayers. Whether I'm wealthy or poor isn't going to change my commitment to being a good person. Whether I'm wealthy or poor isn't going to change my commitment to fulfill my responsibilities to my neighbors, or to my parents, or to my siblings, or to my aunts and uncles, whoever it is. Right? So that's what's meant by reaching a level where Allah's decree, we become indifferent to Allah's decree, where whatever Allah chooses in the end does not impact the way we respond. And then وَسُقُوطَ الْخُصُومَةِ مَعَ الْخَلْقِ. And we fulfill this level of rida when we no longer care to dispute other members of the creation. What does this mean? I'll get to that in a moment. And then the third one is وَالْخُلَاص مِنَ الْمَسْأَلَةِ وَالْإِلْحَاحِ. And to discontinue or to rid ourselves of asking and insisting. And again, what this means precisely, I'll get to in a moment. So, how do we reach this level where we become indifferent to Allah's decision? And again, indifferent based on or according to how I assessed this a moment ago. Well, number one, we do tafweed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you remember the station, we entrust Allah. I am indifferent to Allah's decree, right? Because I have entrusted Allah to make these decisions for me. And that entrusting is built off of the fact that we have come to know Allah. We have come to realize and recognize that Allah is worthy of being trusted. And therefore, I do tafweed of my life to Allah, of my situation to Allah. Why? Because I trust Him to do what is in my best interest. Likewise, the person realizes that he or she is a servant of Allah, and that what it means to be a Muslim is to submit to Allah, to see Allah as the sovereign, the highest authority, whereas we are just a creature under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's kingdom, submissive to His command and to His will. So it makes no difference to me what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses, because I don't see myself as having the right to say this is right and this is wrong when it comes to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is deciding. Likewise, it is something that is centered around love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That when Allah engages me in particular, that my love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is enough to love that which He decrees. Of course, in accordance to how we explained it a moment ago. That the more a person loves Allah, the more Allah loves them. And Allah will then use His qada and qadar in the best interest of the individual. Right? That doesn't mean everything comes the way we want it to be. It doesn't mean we become immune to any qadar that might be uncomfortable for the individual or might cause us grief. But my love for Allah is letting me know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes certain decisions, and because I love Allah, I accept the decision He makes. Likewise, we are ignorant of the true outcomes of Allah of any event or situation. Meaning, I want a job, or I apply for a job. I might get it, I might not get it. I might perceive that getting the job would be good for me, or that particular job is good for me. But how certain can I be of that? It might seem like a good job, it might seem like a great opportunity, but once I enter this job, once I begin, can it turn out to be a disaster? It could. We have an example, Mr. Trump. He was happy when he got elected. He wanted to get elected. It was a disaster for him. Did he perceive it to be a disaster as he was running for election? Probably not. But it came out to be a disaster. Can not getting the job turn out to be something good for the individual? Of course. They might not get that job and go apply for another job that turns out to be a much better opportunity. Or by not getting the job, the person was delayed a month or 2 or 3 from working, but during that time, a job opportunity opened that wasn't open before. So they go apply and they get that better job. So since we are pretty ignorant of where things are going, and we cannot fully assess the outcome of really any of our decisions, we leave it in the hands of Allah, who does know. And therefore, what Allah decrees for us specifically, we become indifferent to, whether He allows it or prevents it. We become indifferent to it. Why? Because, I don't really know where either of these two will lead me. Allah does. And I trust Allah to make the decision to choose for me what will have the better outcome for me. And kind of building off of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always wants what's best for us, whether we recognize this or not. So Allah's decree for a specific individual is always meant to bring about their best interest. Now, if their best interest doesn't come about, it's not because the decree itself was not functioning towards that, but because the individual refused to follow that path. Allah says, accept Islam, that is better for us. And Allah sends du'at, callers, preachers, to people around the globe to call them to this, to call them to what is best for them, but they might choose not to accept it. So Allah wants to decree for that individual what is in their best interest, or has decreed for the individual what is in their best interest, here Islam, but it's upon the individual to accept it. If they accept it, then their best interest comes into play. But if they reject it, that's on them. Among other things, Ibn Qayyim, he has like 60 examples or 60 explanations as to how and why we become indifferent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'll just highlight a few that I think is kind of warm. It brings our heart an amount of warmth, and it can potentially strengthen our iman. Let's see here. So please kind of be patient with me as I try and find them. So one of the benefits of accepting this notion of Allah's decree is in my best interest, and I become indifferent to what Allah chooses for me because I know what He chooses is best, that is, this saves us from becoming slaves of other people. You see, every one of us likes to have a good reputation. Every one of us likes to be praised by other people. Now, that can essentially cause us to become slaves to other people, where our decisions and our behaviors, our choices are made not because of what I perceive to be in my best interest, but rather what I think people will think about me when I do these things. So when you look at celebrities, right, not necessarily the A tier, the highest, the biggest celebrities, but those who are maybe less. They are sucked into this cultural void, or this cultural monster where they always have to keep up. If people aren't enjoying them, they lose their job essentially. If they're no longer popular, they lose their job. No one's gonna hire them for a position or a movie. Right? So they're sucked into this this cultural monster where their success is in proportion to what people think of them, and thus they are slaves of the opinions of people, their whims and their desires. So when our reactions are attached to Allah's qada and qadar, His decisions, and to Allah Himself, it saves us from becoming slaves of humanity. My decisions, my behaviors, my choices are always decided based on what Allah thinks of me, not on what other people think of me. And since we have already established that Allah only wants for the individual that which is in him or her's best interest, then making these decisions according to that is always in my best interest. And that's, I think, a very important part. Another benefit is that it really, accepting Allah's qada and qadar, really brings the heart to a state of peace. It relaxes the heart. Why? Because a lot of our burdens, as a result of this belief, this perception, we put it on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you look at, subhanAllah, when COVID began, I remember reading an article where doctors and nurses and these first responders, they were in a great amount of distress. Why? Because of the deficiency of ventilators. And you have this huge surge of people coming to the hospital, and now they have to make decisions. Who do we give the ventilator to and save their life versus who we don't? And that caused them a great amount of distress. Now for the believer, right, it's not that we are careless, we don't care who lives and who dies. We very much are. But we also recognize that a person is not going to die unless it is their qadar. If a person dies, right, it's not because of my decision per se. It is because it is Allah's decision. Now, this doesn't mean we are not accountable for our decisions, but please just let's leave aside these nuanced questions. If a person dies, that is their qadar. there's nothing else we could have done for them. And therefore that feel of guilt, that feel of responsibility is taken off our backs and put on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, Allah has given us a sharia that can help us make these decisions. Right? If it's between two individuals, the sharia gives us some basic guidelines as to how to make this choice. It has to be one or the other. The sharia tells us how to do that. And thus Allah tells us, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah wants ease for you, He doesn't want hardship for you. But part of that is the fact that the sharia gives us these guidelines that are coming from Allah. And therefore when we follow this, it's not on our shoulders. We say we did what we believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to do. That is Allah's decree. And it takes that guilt and that pressure off of our shoulders. So the more we are understanding of how Allah's qada and qadar works, and the more we embrace it and what it entails and what it means, the more it preserves a peace of heart and mind. And this is something when societies have become more distant from a God-centric life, they have fallen into a lot of emotional distress and emotional problems. Recently I've been watching the show House, the doctor and the craziness, whatever. And you see this so clearly in the personalities of these characters, of these actors. They are constantly in stress over the decisions they make. And if they aren't able to save someone, they fall into a state of almost depression, if not depression. Yes, again, we as Muslims, we're not indifferent to life. Our goal is to preserve life. But we are limited in that capacity. And a lot of it is Allah's decision. Someone died. Yes, we are sad. But قَدَّرَ اللَّهُ وَمَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. We take this for granted. The average Muslim understands what this means. But we have kind of taken it for granted as to how much it really benefits us. And what our life would be like if we didn't have these very repeated statements that we take for granted. SubhanAllah. So the more a person embraces the notion of Allah's qada and qadar and understands it, it eases the heart, takes a lot of these pressures, these concerns, these uncertainties out of the heart. And in replace of that, we are able to do other things in life. Some people who are very, very effective doctors, they're very effective workers, but because of the stress and the uncertainty that they are trying to endure, they are trying to understand, it really hinders their ability to do more for society. Whereas the believer, because that pressure is off of our shoulders, Allah has taken it off of our shoulders, now we have more energy to exert elsewhere for other people. That we don't fall behind because of life and because of Allah's qada and qadar. Likewise, it really opens up a huge door of iman opportunities and opportunities for reward. You see, our physical bodies are limited in its capacity. We can only pray so much. We can only fast so much. We can only give so much charity. Everyone is limited in their capacity. The physical body is a very limited piece of creation. But the heart is really endless. The opportunities of the heart, in terms of its function, and in terms of its function as a vessel of emotions, it's really endless. There is an infinite amount of emotions that we can experience, and how much we experience it is really endless. Is there a limit as to how much we can love someone or something? There is no limit. Is there a limit to how much we can fear something? There is none. Is there a limit to how much sorrow we can feel? You really can't determine that, right? Now, I don't mean that there isn't unhealthy types of emotions. Of course, if any of these emotions goes too far, it can be unhealthy. Or if they are misused or misplaced, it can be very detrimental to a person's health and their well-being. But what I'm saying here is that since Allah's qada and qadar has more to do with the response of our heart and is limited in terms of our response in our physical body, right? It opens up so much opportunity for reward and for iman. No matter how much I study the concept of loving Allah, there is no end to that. And therefore, when I focus on this part, it opens up a endless amount of possibilities. And therefore, the more I understand Allah's qada and qadar, the more I understand Allah Himself, His names and attributes, the one who is administering this qada and qadar, the more opportunity my heart has to get to know Allah, to love Allah, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this can only be perfected when you have this dichotomy occurring in our lives, where there's good and bad. We will not fully appreciate the good unless we have its opposite to compare it to. Just like the example I gave, we will not appreciate heat and what it can do for us, or the full potential of heat, if we don't have cold to endure. Or else, heat would only be something we use for cooking. Without that, what is heat? What is the purpose of heat? I guess you can use it for energy and other things, but it would be limited if it were not for cold. We would miss this opportunity of recognizing a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah might decree something that we initially perceive to be negative. Allah might decree for us something that we initially feel as discomforting or something we don't want. But if we are able to embrace it and apply the station of Rida in regards to it, then it opens up this door of connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our heart, with our emotions, that if it were not for that, right, we would miss it. And know that, as we mentioned before, the three primary emotions in terms of our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is love, hope, and fear. We spoke about this, right? Love, hope, and fear. If it wasn't for uncertainty, there would be nothing to hope for. Hope is only used, it is only expressed when we are not sure if something is going to happen or not. I hope for a good life. I hope for a good afterlife. I hope for health. I hope for, wealth. If I was certain that I have these things, what's there to hope for? So because there's a potential for something negative to occur in our lives, or something we perceive to be negative to occur in our lives, it opens up this door of hope, which is so integral to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows certain perceived evils to happen, and why it's important to reach this acceptance of Allah's decree, to where we become indifferent to what Allah chooses in a manner that I mentioned before. Now, continuing the three conditions of this level, the second condition is that we no longer enter into disputes with the creation. And I'm going to summarize here again. What this means is the following. The atheistic, secular perception of the world that is presented, in media, in schools, in the academy, focuses on kind of this natural selection where the strongest survive. It subscribes to the notion that resources are limited, and as a result, you find so much competition. In order for me to survive, I need to be aggressive. In order for me to become wealthier, I need to defeat the competition. So look at companies. Literally, when you look at corporate America, when you look at corporate America, I mean, it's literally a war. And with their budgets, Apple has a budget greater than most countries of the world. It's a war, and they eat each other up. Every now and then you hear that the biggest of America's corporations, like Disney and Apple and Tesla, they eat the smaller companies or the smaller corporations. Disney bought Fox. They bought Marvel. And Marvel and Fox, in of themselves, I mean, they're not small corporations. They're huge. But Disney is just bigger. So you have this competition. Well, part of it, when you look at capitalists and you look at how these business people, they look and they deal with each other. I mean, it's like, it's either me or you. We can't share the resources. Now, when you compare this to the believers, especially in the early centuries of Islam, there's a famous story of a European spy entering Andalusia. This is, again, the very early centuries of Islam when Muslims were actually, strong in faith and Iman. A spy from Europe entered Andalusia to kind of assess the situation, the strength of the believers. And he said that he went to a vendor in the market and said, "I'd like to purchase this from you." He said the vendor said the following: "I have already sold enough today to meet my quota. My neighbor hasn't, go buy from him." I mean, you would never see this happening here in America. Why did this Muslim say this? Why aren't Muslims in this? Why don't they have this super aggression when it comes to wealth? Why don't they have these uncertainties and fears when it comes to the amount of resources we have? Because we believe we have a Lord who's providing us. I don't need to compete with you because in the end, Allah determines our rizq, how much we have. And therefore, if I take from you, right, it's meaningless for me to compete against you in terms of resources. Well, if Allah wants to provide us both, He'll do it without it affecting either or. It's not that if you sell something, it hurts my wealth. Or if I sell something, it's going to hurt your wealth. We don't see it that way. What Allah wants to give us is determined. And Allah makes this point very clear in the Quran. يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيَقْدِرُ. Allah gives wealth to whom He wills and He withholds it from whom He wills. And therefore, there's no need for me and you to compete against each other over resources. This is what Abu Ismail is pointing to here. We reach this level of Rida, or in order to reach this level of Rida, we need to accept this reality and we need to live by it. The more I understand the dominance of Allah's qada and qadar over what I possess, over the material, the more I realize the uselessness of this worldly competition. Why should I compete with you over the world when it's Allah who's providing the world? And my competition with you is not really going to affect anything. So, sharing doesn't hurt how much wealth I have. If Allah wants me to be a millionaire, I'm going to become a millionaire, even if I don't compete with anyone else, even if I don't defeat any competition. Right? So this is a very different perception of the economy, of the material, in comparison to the secular, capitalistic perception. Likewise, the more we appreciate Allah's control and management, His lordship over the universe, the more we realize that, I don't need to compete with other human beings for what I need. I could go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Him for what I need. Yes, I have to do things. I have to work. I have to make good decisions. I have to plan and have a strategic plan. But I can go to Allah and say, "Hey, Allah, grant me this and grant me. I ask you this and I ask you for that." I don't need to fight other people for that. Now, the only thing that I would kind of qualify here is when it comes to the right of Allah and His Messenger. When people try to suppress or to marginalize or to distort Allah's right and the right of His Messenger and the right of Allah in terms of religion, we don't just kind of we're not neutral about this. We will fight over it. When someone wants to portray Islam as being an evil, violent, terroristic, or terrorizing religion, that anyone who picks up the Quran, they are magically converted into a terrorist, from a very peaceful young boy to a terrorist. Why? Because, well, the Quran did that to them. No, we're not gonna stand for that. We're not gonna be neutral in the face of that. We are gonna push back. So this is the area where we will challenge other people, we will compete with them, we will push back against them. Why? Because, well, this is something that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then finally, I went a little bit over, but please bear with me. The third condition is al-khulas min al-mas'alati lil-khalq wal-ilhah. To discontinue asking, to no longer ask Allah's creation or insist upon them. And essentially, the more we realize that what we have, what happens in our lives, is under Allah's lordship, under His qada and qadar, the more irrelevant the creation becomes in terms of what happens in my life. I don't need to go and ask a bank, or I don't want to use this example, I don't need to go and ask someone for financial assistance when I can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no need for me to insist and to go around to other people and say, hey, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? Can you give me this? Can you give me that? Why? Because, well, I can go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first and foremost. Now, this is not to say that doing this is haram, right? Again, this isn't an issue of fiqh, where is this halal or this haram, or is this haram. This is an issue of spirituality. The more I see Allah's lordship, the more I understand Allah's qada and qadar and how dominating it is, the more I will go to Him for my requests instead of other people. If asking someone else, right, and if they respond to it, say I go and ask Muhammad for a loan. If my perception is that, well, if Muhammad gives me a loan, then it is really in reality Allah's qadar that allowed Muhammad to give me a loan, well, why should I go to Muhammad if it goes back to Allah in the first place? Well, I should go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, oh Allah, allow this to happen. And again, we want to be careful here and not to deny the means that are necessary, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated upon us to take. But this is an issue of spirituality, not an issue of fiqh. No. And that concludes the second level. Now the third level is some of the hyper Sufi stuff. And essentially what Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala says is al-rida bi-rida Allah, accepting Allah's acceptance. And essentially what is meant here is that we kind of fall into this trance, this ecstatic state of hyper spirituality where we no longer see anything else except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The notion of fana, to the extent that it's as if we become emotionally immune to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, even, or what Allah decrees, even, as Abu Ismail says, even if Allah throws him in the hellfire, that we accept this. Now this is hyper spirituality that the Sharia doesn't endorse. And Ibn Qayyim has, throughout the book, pushed back against this perception. So I'm not going to go into details here because I think it's unnecessary. And therefore, we conclude the station of al-rida, and the station of al-shukr follows. And we'll start that next week with Allah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.